Hello, this is the first part of two lectures on World War II. It's important as we begin this to keep in mind where the U.S. was in 1941. The U.S., Franklin Roosevelt, its president in particular, had been determined to stay out of international disputes. This had been a prevailing strain of American foreign policy since the Monroe Doctrine back in the 1820s. We were, for the most part, an isolationist nation, and that was true during the 1930s, during the Great Depression. The U.S. was struggling with this, as were all other industrial nations. So Franklin Roosevelt wanted to concentrate on how to fix the economic problems of the U.S. during the 1930s. But during that decade, certain global events threatened the peace and stability of the world. There was aggression from three particular nations. We'll look at each one of these briefly: Italy, Germany, and Japan. They were being very aggressive toward their neighbors and toward their region. And Roosevelt called this the spreading epidemic of world lawlessness, and it needed to be confronted. But he also needed to concentrate on the Depression. So this is where the U.S. was in 1941. But let's go back a few years and let's talk about these three nations, Italy, Germany, and Japan, just briefly to see how we got to a world war. Let's start first with Italy. In the early 1920s, Italy suffered from unemployment, from inflation, and from a fear of communism. And we're going to see this. A lot of nations, including the US, feared communism. And Italy was one of those. And so the problems that Italy was suffering through in the 1920s were problems that the US would also suffer through mainly in the 1930s. But Italy started its depression a little early. And so it was in this environment that Benito Mussolini seized power in 1925. He became the dictator. And he was popular and had wide appeal because he promised to restore order to a chaotic Italy. And he also promised to restore pride. The Italians were extremely prideful of their nation. Rome was in Italy. So they had an ancient empire. And so Mussolini promised to restore that pride. But once he became dictator, he suppressed all political opposition. And so, again, he was the dictator of Italy beginning in 25. So that's what's going on with Italy. We'll come back to them in just a second. Now let's move to Germany. After World War I, Germany was humiliated. If you can recall the Treaty of Versailles that ended the war, Germany had to pay reparations to certain nations in Western Europe, and Germany had to admit that it had caused this great war. And also, if you recall, the monarch, Wilhelm II, abdicated his position as monarch at the end of the war in 1918. And so when the war was over, there was a time period of confusion in Germany, but beginning in 1919 through 1933, Germany's form of government was a republic. It was a democracy, and the republic was known as the Weimar Republic. The Weimar Republic. And so Germany, as a result of losing the war, lost a lot of territory, including this area, which is going to be important later on, called the Rhineland in Western Germany. So it lost that. France gained control of that. All right, so it's a humiliated nation after the war, and it's in this environment that this man, Adolf Hitler, came to power. Adolf Hitler had been a misfit as a young man. He had few friends. He wanted to be an artist. He apparently was not a very good artist. I've never seen an example of his work. I assume there's some examples out there, but by all accounts, or by most accounts, he was not a very good artist, and he certainly didn't have a future in it. When World War I started, he, along with almost all young men his age in Germany, served in the war. He served at times in the trenches. You know about trench warfare. He served there. In other words, he was on the front lines for a time. He spent a lot of time during the war as a messenger carrying orders from generals who were way back behind the trenches to commanders in the trenches. This was a dangerous job. He was wounded once. He was temporarily blinded by mustard gas at another point. So he was involved in the war um, for several years. When the war was over, he, along with other Germans, again were humiliated. They were angry, and he was kind of rootless there again for a little while after the war. But he soon joined what was called the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the NSDAP, also known as the Nazi Party. This was a political party, and Hitler found a home in this party. He found out that he was quite a skillful organizer. He was quite a skillful politician. He'd never known this before. And he became a leader of the party fairly quickly, beginning in 1921. The party grew. A cult of personality developed around Hitler. He found out that he was also a very talented public speaker, and he was known to have a hypnotic effect on his audiences. So what I'm trying to do here on this slide, and it doesn't appear to be working, is to show you an example of Hitler. Let me go back. Hitler speaking in public. Okay, so it's not going to work. All right, so he learned that he was a talented speaker, and he and his party tried to overtake the government in 1923. In other words, they tried a coup. This is where a group attempts to take control of a government. It was a failed coup attempt. Hitler was arrested, and while he was arrested and jailed for 9 months, he wrote his memoir known as Mein Kampf, or My Struggle. This was a long 720-page memoir about his life, and in it he talked about plans for Germany's future. He was thinking about those things as early as 1923. While he did that, he also wrote about the superiority of the German race, which was, he said, and many others were saying this, he didn't come up with this, a pure race, and Germans should not marry outsiders such as Jews, such as Slavs. In fact, Hitler, along with others, saw Jews as the danger for Greater Germany, or the German Reich, the German Empire. Jews were the danger. There was a Jewish peril trying to destroy the nation of Germany. He said that Jews had conspired during the war to benefit financially from World War I, and they were conspiring again to gain world leadership, and they must be stopped. This Jewish peril must be stopped. So he portrayed himself in Mein Kampf as the savior of Germany. He said he would be the one to save them from the humiliation of that treaty, the Treaty of Versailles that ended the Great War, and he would also save them from the suffering caused by the Great Depression. Yes, Germany was one of the main industrial nations of the time, and it suffered greatly during the Depression. And so we've got this post-war depression, time of national humiliation, where Adolf Hitler comes to power. In 1934, he had enough power to declare himself the absolute leader, the Führer, the dictator of Germany. And it's then that he replaced the Weimar Republic, democratic form of government, with his own Nazi party. And his Nazi party certainly was not ushering in a continuation of democracy in Germany, because they made all other political parties illegal. There were no more elections. And they also quickly began persecuting Jews, remember the Jewish peril, but also communists. Hitler hated communists. All right. So Hitler's proclaimed intention was to extend control of all German-speaking people across Europe. We can distill this down to his goal was to dominate Europe for the Germanic people, to dominate Europe for the Germanic peoples. So we've got these two nations in Europe. Italy and Germany both had the same style of government, and we can call this government fascism. Fascism. This is not a democracy. It's not like a democracy. It has a dictator. So both in Italy and Germany, there were fascist governments with dictators. So let's just read this. A radical form, fascism was a radical form of a totalitarian government. I'll tell you what that means in just a second. That emerged in Italy and Germany in the 1920s. This is where a dictator uses propaganda and brute force to seize control of all aspects of national life. So fascism is a form of totalitarianism. Totalitarianism is just a very aggressive, ideologically driven form of government that tries to subdue all of civil society, tries to subdue all of civil society. It's very powerful. It's overly powerful form of government, and it is obviously a threat to freedom. Now, it's not like communism. In fact, fascism is an enemy of communism. Both the Italian fascist government and the German fascist government were enemies of communism. And one of the ways that fascism and communism differ, one of the main ways, is that fascism defends private property. Communism doesn't. We haven't really talked about what communism means yet, but basically communism is just it's really not even a form of government. It's simply where a private property is obsolete and the people own all property together. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. Okay, so this is what's going on in Europe. Meanwhile, in Asia, Japan was kind of doing the same thing. Japan also had a fascist government, and they were encroaching on their neighbors throughout Asia. So during the 1920s, the Japanese economy was starving for resources. It was growing, and it needed raw materials to fill its growing needs. Well, here's Japan, this rocky collection of islands, not many natural resources, so it needs those resources from other places. So in 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria. Manchuria is this northwestern part of China. Manchuria was rich in coal. Manchuria was rich in iron ore. Steel comes from iron ore, and Japan needed both of those things. So it invaded in 1931 and quickly began occupying Manchuria. Now, you may be wondering how China, so big and populous, would allow Japan to do that, to just invade and occupy part of its territory. Well, China was having its own difficulties during the 1920s and 1930s. China was having a civil war, and it pitted these two men against each other and the people who followed them. Mao Zedong on the left was a communist leader, and he was trying to get his communist group, his communist party, to take over the government of China. Chiang Kai-shek on the right, he was the leader of, we can call them the Nationalist Party or the traditional ruling party of China. They had been in control, and here comes Mao Zedong and these new communists trying to take control away from Chiang Kai-shek and his nationalists. So we've got a civil war going on in China, and this weakened China so that Japan could then invade and occupy Manchuria. Well, Japan wasn't finished in 1931. In 1934, after having built a very aggressive military, Japan then invaded the rest of China. And what it was doing was it was preparing actually to conquer all of Eastern Asia. It's interested in all of this. So the Japanese consider themselves the leading Asian race. This is why they've justified, one of the ways they justified doing this. And they believe that Asia should be just for Asians, not Europeans. So what Europeans had been doing for several decades is they had been colonizing parts of Asia. For example, we've got the French down here in what's known as Indochina. The French had been here beginning in the 1880s, and they had used modern-day Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia as their colony. And so Japan didn't like that. And so they wanted to take control of all of Eastern Asia and kick out these European colonizers. All right, so this is what this menace looked like in 1935. We've got two fascist European nations, Italy and Germany. One has plans to dominate all of Europe. Meanwhile, in Asia, we've got an island nation aggressively building up its military and invading and beginning to occupy parts of Eastern Asia. So this is happening in the 1930s while Franklin Roosevelt was trying to ease the Depression. All right, we're not ready to get to the U.S. yet. They're trying to fix their own problems and they're not involved. But things will happen very quickly now throughout Europe and throughout Asia. In 1935, Mussolini and his Italian army invaded Ethiopia. What Mussolini is wanting here was to expand Italy's sphere of influence. So they invaded Ethiopia. The League of Nations, I haven't mentioned them since we talked about World War I, but the League of Nations did what they could do to stop Mussolini and this invasion. They imposed economic sanctions, but it was quickly learned that the League of Nations really had no teeth. It had a bark, but really no teeth. And so it was really just seen as a weak organization that really couldn't help very much. That happens in 35. The next year, 1936, Hitler invaded the Rhineland. So we've talked about the Rhineland. I showed you where that area was. It's over here in Western Germany. Hitler invaded the Rhineland. Now, this is a problem on all kinds of levels. It violated the Versailles Treaty. Remember, the Versailles Treaty is what ended World War I. It violated that treaty on two main counts. Number one, Hitler had to have an army in order to invade the Rhineland. Well, according to the Versailles Treaty, Germany could only have a very small army, a very small navy. It couldn't have any submarines, couldn't have any tanks, any heavy artillery, no air force. But Hitler, throughout the early years of the 1930s, had been building up the military, violating the Versailles Treaty. So by 1936, his military is strong enough that he can invade the Rhineland and occupy it. This also was a violation of the treaty because the Rhineland had been taken away from Germany. Now, once Hitler did this and Great Britain and France didn't counterattack, he became convinced that both Great Britain and France were cowardly and that they would not try to stop his dominance. So he continued. All right. Also in 1936, Germany, Italy, and Japan enter into an agreement, kind of a weak agreement, but still it's basically just an agreement to safeguard their common interest. And this was known as the Anti-Comintern Pact. The Anti-Comintern Pact. And this is kind of the beginning, or it is the beginning, of what we will call the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan. So the Anti-Comintern Pact, what this really was in the beginning was an agreement to safeguard their interests against the communists in the Soviet Union. Comintern has to do with communism. So kind of the point here is that these three nations are forming what was known as the Axis powers in 1936. All right, 1937, the next year, Japan invaded China. Japan invaded China, capturing the city of Nanking. I thought I had a map there. Nanking was the capital of China at the time. This was a big deal because when Japan captured Nanking, Japanese soldiers kind of ran out of control. They murdered Chinese citizens. They raped a lot of the women. In fact, it's estimated that about 300,000 Chinese were murdered. This is known as the rape of Nanking. And it's a point of contention even today. Japanese leaders, many of them deny that this even happened. All right, 1938, Germany seized Western Czechoslovakia. All right, so here's Czechoslovakia. Germany seized the western part, so it's already seized the Rhineland, and now in 1938 it seizes the western part of Czechoslovakia. And the reason it did this was that there was a large German population in western Czechoslovakia, and so Hitler wanted to add those Germanic people to his Reich, to the German Reich, or the German Empire. Now, once he did this, Great Britain and France got a little nervous, and Hitler promised them he would not annex any more European territory. This was known as the Munich Agreement. The Munich Agreement. Munich is a city in Germany, the Munich Agreement. And so this was Hitler this was actually Great Britain and France trying to appease Hitler, trying to say, okay, please don't do this anymore. And Hitler signs this agreement, promising that he won't do it again. But of course, or maybe not so maybe I shouldn't say of course, but the very next year, Germany broke that Munich Agreement and seized the rest of Czechoslovakia and Lithuania. So Lithuania is up here in the northwestern or northeastern part of Europe. And so Hitler has seized all of Czechoslovakia and Lithuania by the end of 1939. Oh, he's not finished. He then seized Poland. He then seized Poland, also in 1939. So here's Poland. All right, so Hitler is very aggressive in 1939. And once this happens, most of the world did not respond. They're not responding to Hitler's aggression in Europe. But France and Great Britain had been waiting, hoping Hitler would be satisfied and stop. And after they didn't, after Germany invaded Poland, then France and Great Britain declared war on Germany in 1939. Germany's response to this was to quickly invade France. They went through Germany, and they quickly, without much of a battle at all, seized the capital of France, Paris, and they set up a puppet government in Paris. So France is now knocked out. This left Great Britain standing alone against Germany. So Germany now occupied France and most of Italy. And it wanted to knock out Great Britain. So, of course, Great Britain is over here, not part of the continent itself. And so Germany started to bomb Great Britain. This was known as the London Blitz. This occurred beginning in September of 1940, ending in June of 1941. The German Blitz. Blitz is just short for the German word Blitzkrieg, which just means lightning attacks, fast, powerful lightning attacks using surprise. All right. During this time, Winston Churchill became the prime minister, and he said, "Never has a nation been so naked before its foes." Only Great Britain at this point, in late 1940, early 1941, was standing up against the German aggression. Hitler finally stopped this blitz in June of 1941 only because he felt confident that Great Britain was too weak to fight and stop its aggression. So where's the United States in all of this? We'll bring them up in Lecture 2.